It was the rain that first gave the city its sheen of mystery that Thursday morning. London lay wrapped in a damp hush, the cobblestones slick with drizzle, and the fog creeping low, thick enough to muffle hooves and blur outlines. In that muffled quiet, the scream from within the stately home of Horace P. Dalrymple, director of the First Consolidated Bank of London, sliced through the dawn with alarming clarity. By the time the constabulary arrived at the Dalrymple townhouse in Belgravia, the staff had already gathered in the hall, pale and shivering. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Renwick, who had discovered the body slumped over the ornate rosewood desk in the study, a pen still clutched in stiffening fingers, a half-finished note blotched by a spreading pool of blood. The wound to the chest had been precise, clean. The letter, "I can no longer," trailed into a spidery smear. Inspector Lestrade, already red-cheeked from the wind and none too pleased at the early hour, conducted his routine with his usual brusqueness. He asked questions. He barked instructions. He looked for a revolver, found none. No weapon. No sign of forced entry. Nothing stolen. The windows were latched from within. The door to the study had been locked and required force to open. The only key had been on Dalrymple's person. Suicide, likely, Lestrade muttered, rubbing his jaw. But we'll not close it too quick. There's something too neat about it. Which was precisely the moment Sherlock Holmes stepped into the room. He had not been summoned, but word of an unusual death at the residence of a banker with government connections had reached to 1B through a short note slipped under the door and signed. But clearly anticipating Holmes's curiosity, Holmes swept past Lestrade without greeting, his eyes already scanning the walls, the shelves, the body. I followed in his wake, notebook in hand. The study bore the marks of habitual order. Every item had its place. The crystal inkwell gleamed. The desk drawer was locked, but on the rug a small smear of wax, pale green, just beside the leg of the writing desk. Holmes crouched, examined it with a lens. "Interesting," he murmured. Lestrade peered over his shoulder. Candle wax might have dripped from the wall sconces. "No sconces in this room," Holmes said without looking up. "Only an electric lamp, recently installed. That, and no green wax anywhere else in the house. Unless someone took to lighting ceremonial candles in a banker's study." He rose, turned to Dalrymple's body, and sniffed the man's lapels. No gunpowder. This wound was not self-inflicted. And observe there's no blood on the pen. Yet the letter was still being written after the bleeding began. Curious, Lestrade frowned. So, staged a murder made to look like a suicide? Holmes said nothing, but his eyes gleamed. Later, in the drawing-room, we spoke with Clarissa Dalrymple, the widow, a statuesque woman with tightly drawn features and a voice as brittle as cracked glass. She sat stiffly, her teacup untouched. Horace was under pressure, she said softly. This past month he'd grown paranoid. Wouldn't discuss work. Locked away in that study until late hours. And last week he had a visitor. Odd sort. Tall, thin, foreign accent. I didn't catch his name. Holmes asked, "Did your husband mention any concerns at the bank?" She hesitated. only that he was trying to buy time. I assumed it meant financial matters. Holmes nodded once. Then his gaze drifted to the fireplace. On the mantel a photograph. Dalrymple shaking hands with a group of men in suits. One of them had been neatly scratched out, the face inked into oblivion. Holmes lifted the frame and inspected the back. A label, Athens Conference, March 1897. He handed it to me. Make a note of that, and note, too, the scorched corner of the carpet beneath. The grate, something was burned. Recently, as we left the house, Holmes walked briskly, the rain now a fine mist clinging to his coat. He was thinking aloud, more to himself than to me. The locked room, the missing weapon, the unfinished letter, the green wax, all elements chosen not to conceal the crime, but to distract from its purpose. I asked, "What purpose?" Holmes gave a tight smile. "That is precisely what we must discover. But consider, if you wished to remove a man who held sensitive information perhaps tied to financial or political leverage, what better way than to disguise the killing as suicide? Mask the true motive and leave behind a question no one dares to answer. But why the wax? Why indeed? Let us visit the First Consolidated Bank. Perhaps the secrets Dalrymple gambled with are not buried yet." The bank was an austere building, its columns looming like sentinels. We were received with a mixture of courtesy and suspicion. Holmes asked for the late director's office and was grudgingly allowed a brief inspection. The room was pristine too. Pristine. No files left out. No personal items. Only a sealed envelope tucked inside the locked drawer of his desk. Addressed to M.R. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside blank paper. Or so it appeared. He held it up to the light. A faint trace of handwriting appeared, chemical ink, invisible in daylight. "The ledger is not safe. They watch me daily. If I disappear, ask Mycroft. He knows the truth about Prague." "Prague?" I asked. Holmes's face had gone still. The pieces begin to fall. Dalrymple was involved in something larger. The mention of Mycroft implies government entanglement. This was not about embezzlement, Watson. This was intelligence. That evening, Holmes sent a telegram to his brother and lit the fire at Baker Street. His mind worked like a compass aligning to a hidden magnet. The wax, the missing weapon, the burned carpet, the anonymous visitor, all threads leading away from the obvious. And then, hours later, he found it. In Dalrymple's autopsy report, delivered via urgent dispatch, the wound was detailed precisely: a puncture through the heart, but with an unusual upward angle. Not a bullet, a thin, sharp blade, likely inserted from beneath, an assassin's weapon, close range, delivered when the victim was seated on the desk chair. Holmes revisited the photograph. The scratched-out figure. "Watson, prepare yourself," he said quietly. "This crime is not just murder. It is a message, and I believe I now know the recipient." Holmes stood by the window of our Baker Street sitting room, the telegram from Mycroft still clutched in his hand, his eyes narrowing as the street lamps flickered through the misty London night. I had read the message twice and found it curt, even by Mycroft's standards. Dalrymple was compromised, Prague not secure. Beware the envoy. Holmes read it a third time, then dropped it into the flames. He always did enjoy brevity, he murmured. But he confirms what I suspected. This wasn't a matter of banking, Watson. Dalrymple was the keeper of secrets, slightly unwilling ones. I said nothing. There was something in Holmes's posture, a tension in the shoulders, a stillness in the eyes that told me he was already 3 steps ahead, threading connections not yet visible. The next morning, we returned to Dalrymple's residence. This time, Holmes requested a private word with the butler, a square-jawed fellow named Thorne, whose answers the day prior had been precise, if perfunctory. Holmes studied him now with renewed interest, watching not just what he said, but how he said it. Mr. Thorne, you've served the Dalrymple household for 15 years, sir, and never a moment's complaint from the master. No, sir. Yet you weren't on duty the night before his death? Thorne hesitated. No, sir. The master gave us leave early that evening. Said he would be retiring late. Only Mrs. Renwick remained. Holmes tilted his head. Curious. A man under pressure, isolating himself. Tell me, was there anything unusual in his behavior that last week? The butler's lips thinned. He received a parcel 3 nights before it happened. Small, wrapped in oilskin. No return address. He took it directly to the study. I was ordered not to mention it. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And did you obey that order? Thorne looked away. I opened the wastebasket the next morning. Found the oilskin wrapping. Inside was something odd. Waxed seal fragments, pale green. I stiffened. Holmes said softly, "Did you keep them?" Thorne shook his head. He burned the contents in the fireplace. I'm certain of it. The smell sharp, chemical, not like ordinary wax. Holmes made no comment. He merely turned and strode back into the study, where sunlight now slanted through the tall windows. The air still carried the faint scent of smoke and polish. Holmes moved to the fireplace and crouched, brushing aside ashes with his fingers. He paused, drew out a small shard of metal no larger than a coin. It glinted, scorched, and bent. An insignia was barely visible, a stylized eagle clutching a key. Military, Holmes muttered, but not British, Central European. This confirms it, Watson. That parcel contained more than wax. It held a cipher disk, one used to encode or decode sensitive messages. Dalrymple had secrets delivered directly to his door. But why burn it? Because he knew someone was coming, and he did not intend to let them retrieve it. At that moment, Clarissa Dalrymple entered. She was dressed now in grey, her mourning veil pinned with perfect precision. But her eyes betrayed something colder than grief, calculation. Holmes greeted her with the gentlest nod. Mrs. Dalrymple, I must ask, do you recognize this insignia? He handed her the scorched fragment. She looked at it briefly, then returned it without flinching. No, should I? Holmes smiled faintly. Not necessarily, but one must ask. Tell me, did your husband ever speak of Prague? Her eyes flickered barely, but Holmes saw it. Once or twice, she said carefully. He attended a banking conference there years ago. Did he ever mention an envoy? She hesitated a second longer than she should have. No. Holmes's gaze hardened, but he said nothing. He turned, drifting across the study again. Then he stopped at the bookshelf. "Forgive me, may I?" She gave a terse nod. Holmes ran a hand along the rows of leather-bound volumes until he reached a particular book, The Merchant of Venice. He pulled it halfway from the shelf, revealing a small recess behind it, empty. He smiled without mirth. "Your husband hid things here." Clarissa's voice grew sharp. "Mr. Holmes, what exactly are you implying?" "Only that a man does not install hidden compartments unless he is hiding something. And if he burns a cipher and leaves an unfinished note beside his corpse, I begin to suspect he was protecting more than his pride." From outside, the sound of a carriage crunching over gravel reached us. Holmes turned toward the window. A dark coach, unmarked, had stopped before the Dalrymple home. A tall man descended, thin, impeccably dressed, foreign. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "Speak of the envoy." Clarissa turned pale. "You must leave. Now." Holmes ignored her. The doorbell rang. Thorne's footsteps echoed down the hall. Moments later, the visitor entered. He was introduced as Mr. Varga Hungarian by the accent. He carried a slim black case and smiled with professional civility. "I have come to collect some effects belonging to Mr. Dalrymple," he said. "Government documents, you understand, diplomatic in nature." "Of course," Clarissa said too quickly. "My husband mentioned something of the kind." Holmes stepped forward. "And which government do you represent, Mr. Varga?" The man's smile did not change. "That is not relevant. I believe it is, particularly if your visit precedes a formal inquiry into a suspicious death." Varga's eyes narrowed. "I think you misunderstand the nature of my business." "I rarely misunderstand anything," Holmes said lightly. "But let us not delay you. Perhaps you could tell us what precisely you are looking for." "I have a list," Varga replied, opening his case. "Inside documents stamped with crests and sealed in red wax. It would be simpler if I conducted my search in private." "Unfortunately," Holmes said, "this house is no longer under private control. Scotland Yard has placed it under observation." "A lie, but a good one." Varga's smile thinned. "Very well," he said. "Then I shall return with the proper credentials." He bowed slightly to Clarissa and left, his coat swirling behind him like a curtain drawn on a scene. When he was gone, Holmes looked to the widow. "You knew he would come." Clarissa met his gaze coldly. "I knew he would not wait long." "And neither should you." Holmes nodded. "One more question, Mrs. Dalrymple. Why was your husband's chair moved 3 inches back from the desk?" She blinked. I don't know. Perhaps he was rising when no. It was moved after his death. The carpet has a distinct indent. Someone adjusted the scene." He let the words hang in the air, then turned and walked out. Outside, Holmes lit a cigarette with steady hands. "She's lying," he said. "About what?" "About everything. But mostly about what she burned." We paused beneath the portico, the wind rustling the trees. "She knew what was in that cipher," Holmes said. She destroyed it because she feared what would happen if it fell into foreign hands. But she's playing both sides, and Vargahe's not finished. I asked, what now? We go to the bank again. Not for Dalrymple's files, but his vault. Holmes did not speak for the entirety of our carriage ride to the First Consolidated Bank, his eyes fixed on some inward map only he could see. The fog clung to the windows, and the city's pulse seemed to slow around us, as if even London was holding its breath. At last, the coach pulled to a halt, and Holmes descended in a single, fluid motion, already striding toward the bank's entrance with the speed of a man chasing a shadow. The assistant manager, Mr. Felix Thornley, met us in the foyer. He was a tall, reed-thin man with wire spectacles and fingers that twitched constantly at the hem of his waistcoat. He'd been present during our previous visit, though silent then content to linger behind his superior. Now, with Dalrymple dead, he had risen in authority and, it seemed, in eagerness to impress. Mr. Holmes, Thornley said with a practiced smile, we were told you might return. I hope we can be of further assistance. I hope so too. Holmes replied, I require access to Mr. Dalrymple's personal vault. Not the office vault, the one held under executive security. Thornley's fingers stilled. That is highly irregular. Holmes smiled thinly. Irregular, yes, but not impossible. I believe you are now the acting director. Yes, but such a request, Holmes leaned in. Your former director was murdered, Mr. Thornley. The vault may contain documents of interest to both domestic and foreign powers. Would you prefer I return with a warrant and a swarm of officers? Or would you rather we settle this discreetly? Thornley hesitated, swallowed, and gave a single nod. This way. The vault lay 2 floors down. Behind a reinforced steel door, the hissed open with the grinding reluctance of age and secrecy. Inside, a modest row of locked compartments. Thornley unlocked the one marked 7D, then stepped aside. Holmes reached in. A journal, leather-bound, heavy, and wrapped in thin oilskin. Beside it, a second item, a key. Green wax still clung to its teeth. Holmes lifted both objects and turned them slowly in the light. He opened the journal carefully. Encryption, he muttered. Some cipher system. He was cataloguing communications coded entries, cross-referenced by date and name. And here, Varga, C. Midas arrangement. Holmes shut the book. Tell me, Mr. Thornley, did Mr. Dalrymple have any unusual visitors in the past month? Thornley adjusted his glasses. Only one I noticed. An older gentleman, military bearing. Foreign. Perhaps Austrian. I never got a name. He waited. Precisely 6 minutes. Then left. Mr. Dalrymple instructed me not to log the visit. A soldier. Likely the courier for that cipher disk. Holmes murmured. What else? Thornley's mouth twitched. Well, Mrs. Dalrymple visited the bank recently, unannounced, spoke privately with her husband. She left very upset, and the next day, he changed the locking mechanism on his vault. Holmes raised an eyebrow. She never mentioned that. Interesting. Back in the main hall, we were surprised to find someone already waiting for us. A tall, brown-haired woman in modest dress, seated stiffly. her eyes tracking every movement through the room. Thornley whispered, "That's Miss Eliza Warren, Mr. Dalrymple's private secretary. She's requested an audience with you." Holmes approached her without pause. "Miss Warren, I understand you were close to Mr. Dalrymple professionally." She rose with practiced poise. "Yes, sir. I handled his correspondence, kept his calendar, and on occasion managed documents not meant for general staff." Holmes studied her. "Did you notice a change in him recently? A marked one?" He became careful, locked his drawers, refused to dictate letters aloud. Twice I found messages in shorthand he later insisted I destroy. He feared someone was listening. "Did you believe him?" She hesitated. "I didn't want to. But 2 weeks ago, I overheard something odd. He was on the telephone with someone I don't know who. He said, 'We must hold until Mycroft confirms the probe. Channel is dead.'" Holmes's eyes flicked to me. That same phrase. It wasn't just paranoia. Eliza's hands gripped the folds of her dress. The last week, he refused to be left alone with any documents, and he seemed terrified of his wife. That earned Holmes's full attention. Of Clarissa Dalrymple. Why? I don't know. But when she came to visit, his mood shifted completely. Cold. He made me wait outside his office with the door open, which he never did before. She was demanding something said, "If you won't give it to me, then I'll find someone who will." He didn't respond, just kept tapping his fingers. 3 times. 3 times, she nodded. Always 3. On the desk, a tick of some kind. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he turned. "Thank you, Miss Warren. You've been most helpful." Back outside, Holmes's pace quickened. The vault was for more than documents, Watson. It was protection. A place to hide what he couldn't trust even to his own house. And the key matches no known door in his home or office. The green wax, remember, was the trace on the rug. Someone removed something from a compartment likely concealed under or inside the desk itself. It was taken after the murder, not before. I frowned. But who? Holmes didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, we returned to the Dalrymple house once more, and Holmes requested that all the staff be assembled. He questioned each in turn. The cook, the maid, the footman. Most offered little of substance. But when Mrs. Renwick, the housekeeper, stepped forward, Holmes's gaze sharpened. "You discovered the body?" "Yes?" "Yes, sir. I brought up his tea and found him. Like that." "What time precisely?" 7:15. And the police arrived around 7:40. Between those 25 minutes. "Did you touch anything?" She looked startled. "No, sir. I was too shaken." Holmes stepped closer. "Yet you told Inspector Lestrade that you tried to revive him." She blinked. I did. Yes. That's what I meant. You also said the study door was locked. How did you enter?" Her mouth opened, then shut. "I used the master key for emergencies." Holmes's voice dropped. "The key that was supposedly on Dalrymple's body." Mrs. Renwick turned pale. I don't know how it got there. I placed it back afterward. I didn't want trouble." "You placed it back?" Holmes repeated softly. After entering a locked room where your employer was dead and touching. Nothing. Her lip trembled. I panicked. But I swear I didn't kill him. I saw the chair had been moved. Something was sticking out from underneath. I thought it was something dangerous, so I took it. What was it? She said nothing. Holmes stepped forward, his voice quiet but urgent. Mrs. Renwick, if you know where the missing item is, tell me now. There are others looking for it and they are not as patient. She slowly reached into her apron and drew out a folded handkerchief. Inside a slim dagger, elegant, needle-pointed, and on the hilt, a smear of wax, green and still fragrant. Holmes took it carefully, his face unreadable. The murder weapon, he said, hidden in plain sight. Now we begin to see the shape of the truth, but the hands that wielded this blade are not yet known. Only that the blade was made for silence and used by someone who knew exactly where to strike. He looked at me then, his voice low. Let's pay Clarissa Dalrymple one final visit. The Dalrymple house stood quiet beneath a slate-grey sky, its windows like shuttered eyes guarding secrets within. Holmes and I were received this time not by a servant, but by Clarissa Dalrymple herself. She stood in the drawing-room as though she had been expecting us, her arms folded, chin slightly raised. Her morning gown was immaculate to immaculate, for a widow just days bereaved. Holmes wasted no time. Mrs. Dalrymple, he said calmly, do you know this object? He opened the handkerchief, revealing the slim, wax-stained dagger. Clarissa's composure faltered, but only for a second. Her eyes widened minutely before narrowing again, lips drawn tight. I've never seen it before, she said. Though the lie sat uneasily between us, Holmes stepped closer, not accusing, not threatening, just watching. It was found hidden beneath your husband's study chair, the very one you claimed not to have entered in days. She crossed the room, pouring herself a measured inch of brandy. I said I didn't enter after we argued. Before that, I was in and out frequently. I live here. Mr. Holmes, not everything is a clue. Holmes regarded her with a curious calm. You argued. About what? Clarissa hesitated. Money. He was pulling out of an investment we'd made together. Said it was too dangerous. That I didn't understand the risk. I'd invested a great deal. I was upset. Holmes watched her pour. What was the investment? A foreign mining operation. Copper, I believe. Through a shell firm in Prague. I saw Holmes's eyes flicker not with surprise, but with confirmation. Was the name Varga ever mentioned? Clarissa froze. Her hand tightened around the glass. No. Should it have been? Holmes didn't answer. He turned away, studying the fire instead. Your husband believed someone was trying to extract state secrets from him, he said lightly. He kept a coded journal, met foreign agents, and changed his vault locks the day after you visited him at the bank. Clarissa's knuckles whitened around the brandy glass. He said I was being reckless, she whispered. That I didn't understand the consequences. I thought he meant financial ruin. I didn't know. You didn't know he was involved. In intelligence work? No, not exactly. But I suspected. Holmes turned to face her again. And when he refused to release the funds from that operation, you threatened to go to someone else. Her eyes snapped up to his. How do? You know that Eliza Warren overheard you, and Felix Thornley confirmed your unrecorded visit. She blinked, stunned that her movements were not as invisible as she'd assumed. Holmes's voice softened. Mrs. Dalrymple, we found the weapon, but not the hand that wielded it. Yet we now understand motive a chain of them, in fact, greed. For the mining profits, fear that a secret deal would unravel, and jealousy perhaps not for love, but for power. Your husband had it. You didn't, and someone, somewhere, couldn't wait for him to surrender it willingly. Clarissa didn't respond. She stared into the fire, her posture rigid, her silence more telling than denial. Back at Baker Street, the rain had begun again thin, whispering sheets against the glass. Holmes moved with agitation, his hands rifling through papers, his eyes darting between the ciphered journal and his own notes. He muttered as he paced, drawing invisible lines across the carpet. We now have for persons of interest, he said aloud, Clarissa, with motive in profit and access to the crime scene, Felix Thornley, who gains direct control of the bank following Dalrymple's death, Eliza Warren, who had intimate access to private documents and perhaps saw more than she admitted. And finally, Mrs. Renwick, who touched the body, handled the weapon, and lied about both. But each account contradicts some part of the others, I said, and none of them had a watertight opportunity. Exactly. Holmes stopped short. That's what makes it so devilishly precise. This wasn't one motive. It was a convergence, a web of deception, where each strand shields the next. That's why the picture won't resolve clearly, because no single angle shows the whole canvas. He sat, pulling the ciphered journal toward him again. He was using a modified Wegener system. The key was likely a phrase he'd never forget. Perhaps a date. What sort of date? One that mattered only to him, not a public anniversary, but something intimate, familiar. He trailed off, flipping rapidly through the journal. Then he stopped. One entry had a smudge beside it, not ink, but a fingerprint. Holmes lifted it carefully with a magnifying glass, then compared the letters. Here, he marked this line: conduit breached, prog firm compromised, must sever channel, and the date, July 7th. That's the cipher key. He worked with astonishing speed, decoding line after line. Each revealed fragment painted a broader picture. Names, transactions, meetings, the Midas deal, Varga, Thornley, Clarissa. He sat back at last, exhausted but triumphant. Dalrymple discovered the mining investment was a front, not just for laundering foreign funds, but for routing sensitive economic forecasts to Varga's network. He tried to back out, but he was already into deep. I leaned forward, so Clarissa pushed him. She tried to use it as leverage, but I don't believe she killed him. The blade was to precise, silent, swift, someone trained, someone who knew where to strike and how to disappear. He stood suddenly. We must return to the bank now. The rain hammered down as we arrived. Holmes stormed through the doors and demanded Thornley. The young man appeared, paler than before. his spectacles fogged from the humidity. Holmes strode up to him. "You received a package this morning, didn't you? No return address, but you opened it privately." Thornley faltered. I did, yes, but how'd it contained a pocketbook? Red leather. Dalrymple's second ledger. The one you believed. Destroyed. Thornley's face drained. "I don't. Spare us." Holmes snapped. "You knew about the Prague deal. You helped him arrange the transfers. But when he backed out, you saw your opportunity. You didn't kill him yourself, you don't have the nerve. But you provided the key, and possibly the killer." Thornley stepped back. "That's not true." "Then explain how a junior manager was able to override the vault's security on the night of Dalrymple's death unless you had help." Thornley looked ready to bolt, but Holmes advanced. "You thought the ledger was your ticket out. Proof you were involved, yes, but also insurance. Someone sent it back to you to remind you of your place, which means they're tying up loose ends." Holmes's eyes darkened. "And you, Mr. Thornley, are the next loose end." Thunder cracked outside, and with it, something in Thornley broke. "I didn't plan it," he said hoarsely. "I swear, I was threatened by a man named Varga. He promised protection if I stayed quiet. But I didn't know he said it was only to scare him." Holmes caught his arm. "Where did they meet?" "A safe house, East End, Dockside, number 14 Old Shipping Office. Varga's gone now. But if the blade came from him, the truth waits there." Holmes turned to me. "Jaw tight. Now, Watson, we end this tonight." Night had fallen heavily over London, the fog curling low across the Thames as Holmes and I approached the derelict shipping office at number 14, the building, cloaked in rot and rust, crouched among the skeletons of old warehouses like a secret buried in plain sight. Thornley had accompanied us reluctantly, his nerves shredded, clutching his coat like a shield. Holmes moved with quiet purpose, the pistol in his coat pocket unseen, but not unfelt, inside. The air was thick with dust and mildew. Splintered crates lay scattered across the floor, and a single oil lamp cast flickering shadows that danced like ghosts along the walls. In the back room, hidden beneath a torn tarp, we found it a small cache of documents, bound in twine, with a foreign ledger tucked underneath. And atop it all, a sealed envelope addressed simply to the ministry. "In the event of my death," Holmes opened the packet slowly. Inside were pages in Dalrymple's handwriting detailed notes of meetings, names, times, bank account numbers. Varga's name appeared often, always beside dates and payments that matched those in the ciphered journal. The documents were explosive. They would confirm Dalrymple's connection to foreign agents and Thornley's role as intermediary. To the average investigator, it would appear the entire case had resolved itself. Inspector Baines, summoned promptly by Holmes, arrived within the hour. After scanning the documents, his face lit up with the glow of premature triumph. "Well, Mr. Holmes, you've done it again," he said, clapping his hands together. "We've got motive, names, locations. This Varga fellow's practically convicted himself on paper. Thornley confesses to complicity, and with these in evidence, the Home Office can tie off the rest." Holmes stood still, his hands behind his back, staring at the envelope as though it had sprouted thorns. "No," he said quietly. Baines turned. "No? This is too neat," Holmes murmured. "Too timely. Dalrymple dies mysteriously, and only days later, a full confession cache is found untouched in a warehouse that Thornley conveniently identifies. Under pressure, the same Thornley who stood to gain Dalrymple's position and had access to the vault security override." Baines bristled. "You were the one who brought him to us. I brought him because he was lying. But this," Holmes gestured to the documents. "This is a stage set, and the curtain was meant to drop tonight." I watched as Holmes's eyes flicked around the room. "This place has been abandoned for months. Yet there's no dust on the envelope, and the lamp we found, burning when we arrived, it hadn't been lit more than 10 minutes. Someone was here, recently, arranging all this for us to find. And that someone knew we were coming." Baines looked unconvinced, but Thornley's face twisted in confusion. "You think I staged this? I told you I was threatened. I didn't want this. I believe you," Holmes said sharply. "But I also believe you were being used. Someone let you lead us here. Someone wanted this scene discovered, but not by just anyone. By me, because they knew I'd hand it to the police, and they could disappear under the cover of official closure." The silence deepened. Baines shifted, uneasy now. "But if Varga's behind it, he may be. Or he may be the ghost they want us to chase. We've never seen his face. We've never heard his voice directly. Everything we know of him comes through intermediaries. What if Varga isn't a man, but a convenient villain to absorb the guilt while the true architect stays close, watching?" He turned back to the envelope, holding it up to the light. "Watson, take note of this handwriting. It is consistent with Dalrymple's, but look here." He pointed to the signature at the bottom of the final page. "The pressure is wrong. A man writing under stress uses heavier strokes. This is controlled, precise. I've seen this style before." My breath caught. "Are you suggesting someone forged it?" "More than suggesting. This isn't a suicide note, it's a performance." At that moment, an officer entered with news. Clarissa Dalrymple had been taken into custody. Following our last visit, she had booked passage on a ship to Antwerp, with 2 trunks filled with jewelry, bearer bonds, and foreign currency. The authorities were ready to label her the prime conspirator. Her motive laid bare. Baines beamed. "There it is then. She tries to run, and we find her with the funds. She knew the net was closing." Holmes didn't smile. "She's clever, ambitious, but she didn't kill her husband. She didn't write that letter. She was being silenced." Baines blinked. "By who?" Holmes turned to me, his face grim. "Someone who orchestrated every part of this, who manipulated Clarissa's ambition, Thornley's fear, and even the police's eagerness to close the case. Someone close enough to Dalrymple to know about his coded journal. Someone who could plant evidence without being seen, and someone we've overlooked." Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, but Holmes's brow furrowed deeper. "Watson," he said as we left the warehouse, "do you recall Mrs. Renwick, the secretary?" "Yes. She identified the weapon before anyone else had seen it. She said she recognized the style, but that blade was custom-made, not the sort one finds on a kitchen shelf. She might have seen it before, I offered, uncertain. Holmes nodded. She had. Because she procured it. We walked in silence until we reached a hansom cab. Holmes stopped me before climbing in. This is not over. The evidence was too perfect. The arrests too fast. The true killer remains in the shadows. Watson, and we've just stepped into the final act. He tapped the roof of the cab. To Baker Street. And then to St. James's. Mrs. Renwick has some explaining to do. By the time we arrived at St. James's Square, the gaslights flickered warily beneath the morning haze. The grand, ivy-clad structure of the Metropolitan Investment House stood silent, its windows shuttered, save for a faint glow in the upper rooms. Holmes was unusually quiet as we ascended the steps, but his fingers twitched restlessly against his coat. Something in him had quickened a recognition, perhaps, or a memory long shelved, now resurfacing. Mrs. Renwick answered the door herself, dressed not for work but travel. A valise stood beside the hall table. Her face remained composed, but her eyes flickered the moment she saw Holmes. Mr. Holmes, she said evenly, and Dr. Watson. To what do I owe the pleasure? Holmes entered without invitation, his gaze sweeping across the room. You've had a trying week, Mrs. Renwick, preparing to leave the city. She glanced at the bag. Just a holiday. With all that's happened, it seems a good time to step away. Holmes nodded absently, then turned to her with sudden intensity. Tell me, how did you come to work for Edward Dalrymple? She hesitated. I was referred through a placement agency. No, before that, the real beginning. You were secretary to Jonathan Greaves at Landfall Holdings before his trial, were you not? The silence that followed seemed to expand, pressing against the walls. Mrs. Renwick's mask faltered just for a breath and returned. I don't see how that's relevant. Holmes stepped closer. Greaves was convicted of securities fraud in 1887. His ledgers were doctored to mask losses from insider speculation. The entire scheme collapsed when one junior accountant came forward. That man Arthur Dalrymple Edwards' younger brother vanished shortly thereafter. She looked down at her hands. I wouldn't know. I was only a typist then, but you were more than that. You prepared every financial report Greaves signed. You were never indicted, yet your name appeared in a witness statement as someone who warned Arthur Dalrymple to leave London. And you vanished from the public record until reappearing as Edward Dalrymple's secretary. 5 years later, her composure cracked. That was a long time ago. Holmes's voice softened, and yet it casts a long shadow. Arthur was never found. Many assumed he fled abroad. But what if he never left London? What if he changed his name, buried his past, and re-emerged with a new identity and a fortune to match? Her face paled. You're saying Edward was Arthur Dalrymple? The real Edward Dalrymple died in a train accident in Paris in '89. No body recovered, but enough confusion to obscure the truth. Arthur stepped into his brother's identity, assuming his credentials, his network, and his enemies. Watson exhaled sharply. So the victim was living under a false name. But why would that lead to murder now? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Because secrets like that attract more than just shame. They attract debts, grudges, and unfinished business. Mrs. Renwick sank into a chair. Her voice was distant now. I didn't know everything. I knew he'd changed his name, but not why. He offered me a job when I was at my lowest. I owed him my livelihood. And in return, Holmes said gently, you protected him. Even when the past started catching up. She nodded slowly. I didn't kill him, Mr. Holmes. But I know who did. The silence was absolute. Clarissa was clever. Yes, but she wasn't ruthless. She didn't have the instinct to destroy a man. The one who did was Greaves's daughter. Holmes froze. Diana Greaves, I asked. The museum curator. She changed her name to Diana Vargo after her marriage. Her husband died young. She's quiet, cultured, connected in all the right places, and utterly devoted to restoring her father's legacy. When she discovered Edward's true identity, she didn't go to the police. She infiltrated his world. Holmes was already pacing. The anonymous funder behind the museum's capital expansion Dalrymple. The encrypted journal and insurance policy. Thornley's fear engineered by Diana. She wasn't trying to expose him. She wanted to destroy him piece by piece. Mrs. Renwick nodded. She visited the office often under the guise of discussing a donation. But she always asked strange questions about the vaults, the safes, the cleaning schedules. One day, I found her standing at Edward's desk while he was out. She smiled, said she'd dropped her handkerchief. Holmes stopped pacing. She staged the murder, he said quietly, framed it as a foreign plot. Used her knowledge of Arthur's crimes to shape the narrative. Varga wasn't a real man, he was her fiction. A shadow to pin it all on. And the warehouse documents? I asked. She forged those too. Mrs. Renwick whispered. I helped her. I thought it would stop things, not make them worse. Holmes didn't respond immediately. His face was drawn, eyes narrowed in thought. She's done this before, he said suddenly. Watson, do you remember the Westbridge forgery case in 1893? The one where 3 banking partners died of natural causes within 6 months, leaving Diana Greaves as the sole heir to a mysterious trust? I blinked. Yes, but no one could prove anything. Because she never left evidence, Holmes said grimly. Until now. He turned back to Mrs. Renwick. Where is she? She keeps an estate outside Brighton, but she travels often. You'll have to be quick. Holmes nodded once. Thank you, Mrs. Renwick. You've just reopened the case. As we left, the weight of the truth pressed heavier than ever. The murder had never been about espionage or treason. It was about vengeance, cold and methodical, stitched across decades. A dead man's name, a family's disgrace, and a woman with the patience of a spider. Somewhere on the coast, Diana. Vargo waited behind polite smiles and perfect manners, certain her performance was complete. But Holmes was already reaching for the final act. 2 days later, Holmes and I stood beneath the rustling boughs of a windswept estate on the outskirts of Brighton. A grey stone manor loomed behind tall wrought iron gates. its turrets stark against the late afternoon sky. This was Diana Vargo's sanctuary, where wealth met taste and secrecy. Holmes had said little during the journey, absorbed in some silent calculus of thought. But now his eyes were sharply alert, flicking over the neat hedges, the gravel path, the house's perfect symmetry. Too perfect. The butler greeted us with a stiff bow and led us to a drawing-room bathed in golden light. Diana stood beside the window, framed like a painting, composed, elegant, and wholly unsurprised to see us. Double quotes Mr. Holmes, she said smoothly. I wondered when you would arrive. The papers said little, but I imagined you'd dig deeper than most. Holmes offered a polite nod. The matter was too curious to ignore. She gestured toward two chairs. You've come to accuse me, I presume. Not yet, Holmes replied, taking a seat. I prefer to ask questions first. Accusations are terribly final. She smiled, but there was something brittle beneath the surface. Ask, then. I have nothing to hide. Holmes leaned forward, slightly, his tone casual. You knew Edward Dalrymple well, I believe. Or should I say Arthur Dalrymple? Her brows lifted, but she showed no visible shock. That depends on whether you can prove such a thing. Oh, I intend to, Holmes said, but today I came for something more personal. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small, worn envelope. It bore a faded seal, a blot of ink on the corner, and a scent of old paper. Do you recognize this? Diana took it, her fingers hesitating ever so slightly. Where did you get this? It was in Dalrymple's desk, tucked behind a false panel. Odd place for an empty envelope. No contents, no address, just the seal of Landfall Holdings. An old wound, buried too long, perhaps. She studied it carefully, the flicker in her eyes betraying something more than recognition. Holmes continued, voice steady. There's something curious about it. The wax seal broken and then repaired. Unusual, wouldn't you say? Diana set it down. I wouldn't know. I've never handled one before. Holmes's expression was unreadable. That's a pity. Because we dusted it for trace elements, the sealant used to reseal it. A resin compound common in art conservation, rare in correspondence. Your field of expertise. Is it not? Her eyes narrowed for the briefest instant, and more curious still, Holmes went on. Inside the seal was a single strand of copper filament, almost invisible. When examined under a magnifying lens, it showed signs of contact with an igniter-like one used in chemical time fuses. She stiffened. You're suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Holmes said smoothly, only that the envelope was tampered with, and you, Diana, are one of very few people who would know how to do it. The silence that followed stretched like wire. I watched her carefully. No twitch, no frown, but her fingers clenched against the chair's armrest. Holmes had struck a nerve. I wonder, he said softly, what sort of message would be sent? In a letter that dangerous, a warning, a confession, or perhaps a trigger. He stood, walking toward the fireplace, where a chess set stood mid-game atop a low table. The black queen had been toppled. He picked it up, set it gently upright, and murmured, It's always the queen who moves most freely. who strikes from distance and disappears behind the lines. Diana rose, her voice cool. Are we playing games now? Mr. Holmes, only testing strategies, he said without turning. Would you like to hear mine? She said nothing. I believe Edward Arthur feared you, but not enough. He underestimated the elegance of revenge. You didn't need violence. You just needed time, access, and the right pressure. A forged document here, a whisper in the ear of a frightened associate there. You constructed Varga as a ghost, a myth, a cover, and then you sealed the final act with that envelope of fuse disguised as history, still silence. Then she laughed once sharp and humorless. All this. From an envelope, Holmes turned to face her. No, not only. There's also the other matter. What other matter? He reached into his pocket again and retrieved a single playing card worn, smudged. The Queen of Spades. Her eyes locked on it. The mask slipped. Not entirely, but enough. I found it in your museum, tucked behind a brass plaque in the Dalrymple wing, as though someone wanted it to be discovered. But not too soon. Her voice was faint. That's ridiculous. Holmes stepped forward. The Queen of Spades la Dame de Pique, the card of misfortune, of hidden danger, of revenge. It was Arthur's favorite card to carry in games of bluff. You left it there as a mark, didn't you? A trophy or a confession? She said nothing. Holmes studied her, then leaned in slightly, voice low. You want to tell the truth, not to exonerate yourself, but because you want it known. What you did, why you did it, not for justice but for legacy. She stared at him, breathing shallowly. You wanted him to suffer, to lose everything the way your father did. But your plan was to perfect, and perfect plans unravel the moment they are touched by real grief. She exhaled, slow and trembling, and for a moment I thought she might say it might confirm everything. But she looked away, then toward the window. Is this the part where you rest me, Mr. Holmes? No, he said quietly. This is the part where I give you a choice, speak, and control your story, or remain silent, and let others tell it for you. She closed her eyes. Behind us, the wind stirred the curtains. Somewhere far off, a gull cried over the sea. Then she spoke. Tomorrow morning, she whispered, there will be an auction, a final dispersal of Edward's assets. In one of the ledgers, lot 39, there's a code, not just numbers. It's everything, the past, the payments, the threats. You'll find your proof. Holmes didn't move. You've made your move, she said quietly. Now I've made mine. We left without further word. As we walked back to the carriage, I finally spoke. You didn't expect her to admit it outright. No, Holmes said, but she gave us the clue all the same. She wants to be caught. No, he said. She wants to be understood, and that makes her more dangerous than ever. The morning of the auction broke with a soft drizzle misting the streets of London, casting everything in a silver sheen. Holmes and I arrived at Harrington's auction house an hour before the first gavel would fall. The interior was already buzzing. Agents, collectors, brokers, and curious elite lined the mahogany-paneled hall, their voices humming like bees around honey. At the far end, Lots were displayed under glass. Dalrymple's rare books, ancient. Ledgers, a collection of art pieces too obscure to be valuable to anyone but the obsessive. Holmes barely glanced at them. His eyes were set on Lot 39, a nondescript black-bound ledger, labeled simply Varga Investments Confidential Accounts. It lay behind a locked case, tagged and catalogued like any other relic of a fallen empire. But Holmes had the look of a man watching a fuse edge toward gunpowder. We approached the registrar's desk, where a young man with slicked hair and nervous fingers checked the ledgers. Holmes produced his credentials with swift precision. "I need access to Lot 39 immediately. It is part of an ongoing investigation into the death of Edward Dalrymple. This document may contain key evidence." The registrar blinked, flustered. I'm not sure if Holmes leaned forward. "This isn't a suggestion, young man." Within minutes, we were escorted into a private viewing chamber. The glass case was unlocked under the presence of a supervisor and two porters. The ledger was set before Holmes on a green velvet pad. He opened it slowly, reverently, and began scanning the pages. "Columns of numbers," I murmured, peering over his shoulder. "Not just numbers, names, too. Shell companies, coded transactions, payments spread across Europe. Some entries are in cipher, and are here, transfers matching the dates surrounding the Bennett scandal." He tapped the margin beside an entry, marked Alto V, and the date March 14th matching the forged memo Diana had presented to Parliament. "It's all here," Holmes said, voice taut with satisfaction. "Proof of internal manipulation, blackmail money, even political payouts. If this ledger is authenticated, it'll dismantle half the city's boardrooms." He closed it gently and handed it to the supervisor. "This must be placed under protective custody, sealed, and escorted by police to Scotland Yard." "I'll see to it myself," the supervisor promised. We departed shortly after, confident the ledger was now beyond the reach of sabotage. But confidence, as Holmes often warned, is a luxury seldom affordable in our line of work. That evening, just past 9, Inspector Gregson arrived at Baker Street soaked, pale, and breathless. He clutched his bowler in white-knuckled hands. "It's gone," he said. Holmes rose slowly. "What's gone?" "The ledger. Lot 39. It never reached the Yard." "What?" Gregson nodded. "We received the crate sealed, labeled, but when opened, it held a brick, wrapped in newsprint. The ledger's gone, Mr. Holmes. What some time between your departure and the arrival at our vault." For a moment, Holmes said nothing. Then he turned to the fireplace and braced both hands against the mantel, his shoulders taut with fury. "Who had the box in transit?" "Only trusted agents," Gregson said. "The crate left with our sergeant and 2 escorts, somewhere between the auction house and the Yard. The switch happened, and the supervisor disappeared." "Name was Roger Small. The auction house claims no such employee exists on record." I stared. "Then we've been played." Holmes turned, eyes glinting like steel in shadow. "Not played, challenged." Gregson added, "We've begun sweeping the auction house for clues. But with the crowd today, anyone could have mingled in and replaced the crate." Holmes paced slowly, It was too deliberate, too precise, not just a theft, this was timing, a message. He stopped at his desk and retrieved the Queen of Spades. From his drawer, the playing card recovered from Diana's museum. She's warned us before. He muttered, left breadcrumbs as if inviting us to follow. But this, he set the card beside a blank envelope. Now she's begun erasing the trail. Gregson frowned. You believe Diana Vargo orchestrated this theft? I believe, Holmes said, that someone close to her is cleaning up the operation. The real Vargo of Diana is merely a mask, would never risk the exposure that ledger represented. It had to vanish, and now, with it gone, every suspect becomes both accomplice and victim. He turned to me. Watson, we need to revisit the list of attendees, the auction guest log. If the person who stole the ledger mingled with us, they will have left something behind, a trace, a face. That night, Holmes hardly slept, while I scoured names, addresses, and records. He traced every step the crate took, building a map across our table with pins and red string. At dawn, he discovered the van used for delivery had changed routes midway, detouring through a narrow alley off King Street for 7 minutes. Long enough for a switch, Holmes muttered, but too short for a mistake. Whoever did this rehearsed it, I asked. Do you think Diana planned this alone? She gave us the ledger, Holmes said. But someone else, someone afraid of what it revealed, took it back. We're no longer chasing a single criminal, Watson. We've stepped into a battlefield of secrets. A knock came at the door. It was a messenger with a parcel marked no return address. Holmes took it, opened the lid, and stared. Inside was a single page from the ledger. It bore only one entry, a coded payout to Client M, dated the same day as Dalrymple's death. Tucked beneath it, the Queen of Spades. Holmes's voice was low. They've burned the evidence, but left the flame at our door. He turned to me, grim. The real game, he said, has just begun. It was scarcely 2 days after the Queen of Spades arrived. In that anonymous parcel, when the second blow fell swift, silent, and devastating. We had spent the hours since scouring the ledger page for clues, cross-referencing coded entries and matching handwriting samples. Holmes was convinced that Client M was someone still walking free, possibly even one of the very people we'd questioned. Then came the telegram received from Inspector Gregson. 5 words only. Sebastian Vargo found, shot dead. The air in Baker Street chilled as Holmes read it aloud. Vargo, Diana's elusive older brother, the alleged ghost behind the shadowy financial empire gone. We rushed to the scene immediately. The body had been discovered in a vacant flat on Caxton Street. The furnishings were minimal: a writing desk, a tattered sofa, and a carpet that reeked of mildew. Vargo lay slumped in the armchair, a neat hole through his temple. The pistol dropped at his feet. At first glance, it looked like suicide, but Holmes needed no more than a minute to dismiss that theory. Look at the blood spatter, he said, gesturing sharply. Minimal staining on the right side of the chair, and yet the wound is to the left temple. He's right-handed. We confirmed that from Diana's notes. He would never shoot himself left-handed. Gregson nodded grimly. We found no sign a forced entry. But the lock shows subtle tampering. Someone picked it clean. Holmes crouched beside the body and examined the folds of Vargo's coat. He pulled a small envelope from the inner pocket and opened it carefully. Inside was a torn scrap of paper bearing a single line. "I wasn't the only one." He stood, eyes distant. He knew he was being silenced, but not by his sister. Vargo was protecting something or someone far more dangerous. "And now he's dead," I murmured. "Just like Dalrymple." Gregson motioned us toward the desk. "There's more." This was found underneath. A false panel in the bottom drawer had concealed a thin dossier, nearly missed during the initial search. Inside were copied bank records, internal memos, and several photographs grainy, taken from a distance. One image showed Edward Dalrymple shaking hands with a man whose face was turned just enough to obscure clear identification. But Holmes froze, staring at the man's cufflink, a queen of spades. "Not a signature," he whispered, "a calling card. Whoever this is, he's our puppeteer." I leaned closer. Then who was Diana working for? Or with? That, Holmes said, is the true question. Our next steps were clear: track the origin of the photograph, identify the location, and find the connection between the victims. But before we could proceed, tragedy struck again, this time much closer to home. It was 11:30 that evening when I heard the crash, a sound like splintering wood from downstairs. I rushed out of my room only to find Holmes already in motion, revolver in hand. Striding toward the staircase, Mrs. Hudson's cries echoed from below. We reached the sitting room to find the door hanging from its hinges, our bookcases upturned. A figure in black darted through the open window as Holmes fired once. Then again, but the assailant vanished into the alley. A quick search revealed nothing stolen except one item. The remaining page from the ledger. Gone. Holmes paced the room furiously, nostrils flaring. "They're escalating," he growled, not only covering their tracks, but attempting to unnerve us. Gregson arrived shortly after, having received an urgent call from the beat constable who saw a figure fleeing Baker Street. He brought grim news. "There's been another incident," he said, wiping his brow. "Diana Vargo has disappeared. Her flat was found ransacked, blood on the floor. No sign of her." Holmes turned to him sharply. "Dead?" "No body," Gregson replied. "But it doesn't look staged. Either she's been taken or she's on the run." Holmes stared out the shattered window into the rain-slick street. "She was the bait," he murmured, "a decoy. All along, someone else was orchestrating the play." We returned to Vargo's flat one last time that night, determined to find what we had missed. While Gregson secured the building, Holmes examined the fireplace, and there, inside the ashpan, he found half a burned photograph. Only the edge remained, but enough to see Diana Vargo's face, standing beside someone else. The remaining person's features were destroyed by fire, but the visible shoulder bore a crest. Surmise. Holmes stared at it with grim certainty. We were wrong to think this was confined to Dalrymple and Vargo. This is larger, systemic. Someone in government, someone with access to records, to transport. Two men capable of murder and vanishing without a trace. Gregson's face blanched. "You think we're dealing with a conspiracy?" Holmes didn't answer. He retrieved the Queen of Spades playing card from his coat and stared at it in silence. Then, quietly, he said, "I think we're dealing with a war hidden beneath the surface of our institutions, and the first shots have only just been fired." Watson's voice, steadier than mine, broke the silence. "Then what now?" Holmes looked at me with eyes sharper than steel. "Now, Watson," he said, "we stop reacting and begin hunting, before another one of us is silenced." By dawn the following morning, the wreckage at Baker Street had been swept away, but the sense of intrusion remained heavy in the air. Holmes stood by the hearth, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the final page of the ledger had been. The Queen of Spades card lay on the mantel like a dare. "Everything they've done," Holmes muttered, "has been to conceal one name. Not Dalrymple, not Diana, not even Vargo. One name missing from that ledger, a ghost within the system." I watched him pace, his fingers tapping against his lips, eyes darting as if mapping unseen connections in the air. Gregson's latest update had been equally grim. Diana still missing, no sightings, and the blood found at her flat now confirmed to be hers. Yet Holmes remained unsatisfied. "We must stop looking at what they took," he said abruptly, turning on his heel, "and instead focus on what they left behind." He seized a piece of note paper and quickly sketched the room in Vargo's flat from memory, its position, the false drawer, the desk, the fireplace. Then he drew a second version, this time with annotations, where the burned photograph had been found, where Vargo had sat, where the hidden file had been retrieved. "Watson," he said, jabbing the pencil at the paper, "what's missing here?" I studied the drawing, but saw only ordinary furnishings. Then I frowned. The desk lamp. There wasn't one, exactly, and yet the power switch beside the baseboard had been recently used. That flat had electricity, but no light fixtures, unless he was already in motion, coat flying. We returned to the Caxton Street flat with Gregson, who ordered the constables out while Holmes went directly to the baseboard. He removed the wood panel with a pocket knife and revealed a narrow void behind it, dustless and recently disturbed. From it he drew a thin metal box. Inside were microfilm slides, dozens of them, each labeled with code numbers, dates, and initials. Holmes sorted through quickly until he froze on one labeled HM. TG 414, His Majesty's Treasury. Thomas Greaves, April 14th. Greaves, the permanent undersecretary whose name had surfaced once in Dalrymple's appointment book, then vanished from the records like smoke. Holmes held it up to the window, eyes narrowing. Vargo was collecting insurance. This is the real ledger, the one he couldn't afford to lose. This is what they were looking for. We brought the microfilm to a trusted archivist who owed Holmes a favor. Within hours, the film was projected and enlarged. It showed transaction records, marked with hand-inked annotations in a meticulous, slanted hand. The recipient on half the deposits, QS Enterprises, Queen of Spades. There was no registered business by that name. But the routing paths carefully tracked by Holmes showed that the money had moved through dummy companies, all ultimately leading back to one physical address, a private club on Wimpole Street. It was called the Spade, and it served only invitation-holders. Holmes wasted no time. That night, dressed as a disheveled solicitor, he gained entry under a false identity. I waited nearby with Gregson and to plainclothes officers, should trouble rise. He returned 14 minutes later, face pale, jaw set. "He's there," he said simply. "I saw him with my own eyes." "Who?" I asked. Holmes's answer chilled me. "Sir Thomas Greaves." And he wasn't hiding. We knew then that the power behind the crimes wasn't merely criminal, it was institutional. Greaves, Dalrymple, Vargo, and the unnamed man in the burned photo, all part of a hidden operation laundering government funds into illegal ventures through the bank. But Greaves had removed everyone who knew too much. Dalrymple silenced, Vargo hunted, Diana missing. Possibly the last loose thread. It was as we were reviewing the photograph again later that night, the one Holmes had salvaged from the fire, that the pattern clicked into place. Holmes stared at the edges of the crest on the sleeve. "It's not surmise," he murmured. "It's the Whitestone Club. Private, parliamentary members only." He retrieved a second image, one from Dalrymple's office, taken early in the investigation. A portrait on the wall. The same crest, then, he gasped. The man in the background, the reflection in the window. I squinted and saw it barely discernible, but unmistakably someone watching from the hallway, half obscured in shadow. "Do you recognize him?" I asked. Holmes did not answer. He moved instead to the file drawer and pulled free a page from Diana's client's schedule. Her final appointment before Dalrymple's death had been with someone listed only as M. Lyon. Holmes traced his finger under the name. M. Lyon. Not a person, a cipher. He opened the chess box, the one that once held the Queen of Spades, and took out a note. Hidden beneath the velvet lining, a single phrase had been etched in faint pencil, missed during earlier inspections. King follows Queen. Lion watches. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke, quietly, as though the realization had stalked him for days. "We've been thinking of the Queen as the culprit, but in chess, the Queen opens space for the King to strike." He looked up, eyes glittering. "We're hunting the wrong piece." The revelation was staggering. Everything made sense now, the misdirection, the layers of deception. Vargo and Dalrymple were both expendable. Diana had been manipulated. Greaves was not acting alone. He served someone else. And Lyon, whoever, or whatever it was, watched from the shadows. Holmes turned to Gregson. "We need warrants for Greaves, for the Whitestone Club, and every piece of property under the alias QS Enterprises." Gregson hesitated. "Do we have enough?" Holmes placed the microfilm slide in his hand. "We don't need to convince Parliament, just a judge with courage." Gregson departed to secure the papers, and Holmes returned to the window, watching the street. In silence, the pattern had emerged. The pieces were on the board, but Holmes knew the final move had yet to be played. The morning after Holmes's revelation passed with agonizing slowness. Gregson had secured the warrants barely, after hours of backroom wrangling with a sympathetic judge in Southwark. Holmes, meanwhile, remained withdrawn, poring over a series of seemingly disconnected files: Whitestone Club membership records, government appointment registers, and intercepted bank statements. But beneath his silence, I sensed a terrible clarity forming, like a thunderstorm just before it breaks by late afternoon. Our small team assembled outside a nondescript townhouse in Marylebone, officially a law firm. But the building's true purpose was far more clandestine, owned by a shell corporation linked to QS Enterprises. It was one of 3 locations Holmes had identified as critical to the operation. Holmes didn't knock. With Gregson and a constable flanking him, he simply stepped inside, flashing the warrant at the startled clerk and making straight for the basement. There, behind a false wall, we found the heart of it all: rows of ledgers, confidential communiques, to filing cabinets stuffed with encoded minutes from secret meetings. In the corner, a mahogany desk with a crimson leather blotter and a nameplate: Sir Thomas Greaves. But the man himself was not there. What was there, however, was a sealed envelope, addressed to Holmes in looping black ink. He slit it open. "You were always going to follow the trail. That was the point. You think this is about money, Sherlock? About greed or betrayal? You're wrong. The Queen distracts. The King remains untouched. But let me gift you the truth, since you've earned it." Enclosed was a photograph, a boy 10, perhaps 11, standing at the gates of a sprawling estate. His hand was clutched by a woman. Her face was turned away, but her body was unmistakably familiar. Holmes stiffened. "Diana," I said quietly. He nodded. "And the boy is Vargo, as a child." We returned to Baker Street, minds racing. Holmes retreated again into his private world, emerging after 2 hours with a single page. It contained a name I had never seen before: Marius Vargo Lyons, the Queen of Spades. Holmes murmured, wasn't Vargo's codename. It was his mother's, and suddenly it fell into place. Vargo hadn't created the network, he had inherited it. The criminal empire that had shadowed British finance wasn't a recent fabrication. It was the continuation of something older, something tied not to Parliament, but to the peerage. He laid out the timeline for me. Voice low and steady, Vargo was born into a disgraced noble line. His mother, Lydia Lyons, was cast out after an affair with the government minister Greaves. But she didn't vanish. She created a mechanism for vengeance. QS Enterprises. She taught her son everything: how to build influence, how to create plausible fronts, how to make yourself necessary to powerful men. Holmes pointed to the photograph again, and when Vargo reached adulthood, he took the helm. Greaves used him for his laundering, but Vargo had plans of his own. I sat back, stunned. So Greaves murdered him to shut it down. Holmes's expression darkened. No, Greaves didn't kill him. He used him. The murder was staged. Vargo is alive. The silence hit like a thunderclap. Impossible, I said. But Holmes only gestured to the crime scene photo from the vault. Look again. The body's left hand gloved, the right bear. But Vargo was left-handed. His dominant hand was missing its signet ring. That body wasn't Vargo's. The Queen of Spades had never been eliminated. The king had never been the true danger. This was a son's vengeance. Not for money, not even for power, but for legacy, everything. Holmes whispered, was done to complete her work. He doesn't want wealth, Watson. He wants retribution against every institution that destroyed her. But what of Diana? I asked. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, she was trying to stop him. Holmes turned to the hearth, retrieving the ciphered page we'd found at Dalrymple's. He cracked the final line that night. The air has no need for gold-only fire. We had misread it as greed. It had been ideology all along. Holmes paced like a man haunted. He doesn't care about being caught. He wants to collapse the system, not take it over. A sudden knock at the door startled us both. Gregson entered, pale. Another note, addressed to you, left on the doorstep. Holmes unfolded it. One sentence, your move, detective, the Queen, never left the board. There was a chill in the air despite the fire. Holmes sat at his desk, a look of grim determination crossing his face. He's forcing me to think like him, he said. And I'm starting to understand why that frightens me. Then he looked up at me. Tomorrow, we draw him out. And for the first time since this began, I saw something that unsettled even Sherlock Holmes. Not a criminal, but a true believer. The next morning broke grey and sullen, as though the sky itself sensed the weight of what was to unfold. Holmes was already dressed when I emerged from my room-dark coat, gloves, and that impenetrable expression he wore only when he knew danger was no longer theoretical. Gregson arrived a moment later, breathless and alert. Everything was ready. We had chosen the white stone club not for its symbolism, but for its practicality. Its architecture provided multiple points of ingress and egress, and it was one of the last places Vargo might believe we would return to. And it was his sanctuary, once. Holmes always said, a man will return to the last place where he believed himself untouchable. The plan was as delicate as it was risky. The message Holmes sent encrypted with Vargo's own cipher invited him to a final transaction under the guise of Greaves's secret heir, offering what Holmes knew Vargo truly craved, access to the full names behind the Queen of Spades ledger. The bait was greed, but the hook was something deeper: control. Holmes knew Vargo could not resist it. We arrived an hour early, setting our positions. Gregson and two men hid in the drawing room, behind the bookcases, while I waited just outside the rear terrace, revolver tucked beneath my coat. Holmes sat alone in the main hall, an unopened ledger atop the mahogany table, the fire behind him flickering low, casting dancing shadows across the carpet. At exactly 6 o'clock, footsteps echoed from the hallway, smooth, purposeful, Marius. Vargo stepped into the room. He was thinner than the photographs, paler, but his eyes ice grey and unreadable held the same burning precision. His coat was spotless, his gloves immaculate. He said nothing as he stepped into the light and studied Holmes. I wondered if you would try to impersonate Greaves, he said, but no, too crude. You lured me here yourself, baited the trap, and you walked in anyway, Holmes replied, calmly. Why? Vargo smiled faintly. Because I had to see the man who thinks he understands me. There was a flicker of silence dense, brittle. Holmes gestured to the ledger. You know what's inside. I know what's missing, Vargo said, approaching the table. You have the pages Greaves kept hidden. The unredacted accounts, the list of traitors. Traitors? Holmes echoed. You mean clients. They were clients. Now they're evidence. Holmes didn't flinch. You planned to bring them all down. Not just Greaves. Everyone. Parliament. The bank. Even your own allies. Vargo's voice turned cold. They were never allies. They were fuel for every bribe, every secret, every lie. It all leads to the fire, and once it burns, we start again. Holmes stood slow and steady. You talk like a revolutionary, he said, but your hands are clean. You never took the risks your mother did. She believed. You manipulate belief. Vargo's jaw tightened, a crack in the forehead. You speak of her as if you knew her. I do know her, Holmes said. I read her letters, her journals, her code. She wasn't building chaos, she wanted justice. You've twisted that into vengeance. Vargo stepped closer. You think I did this for her approval? No, Holmes said. You did it because without her cause, you're just another criminal. That was the moment the mask slipped. Vargo lunged not with violence, but desperation. His voice cracked. You don't understand what it cost. What it meant to rebuild everything she lost. I became what they feared, and now they'll see how right she was. In one motion. Holmes flipped the ledger open and Vargo froze. Inside, instead of names, was a single photograph, Lydia Lyons, holding her son's hand at the estate gates. Below it, a handwritten note in Holmes's own script. She believed in truth. You believe in spectacle. Behind the bookshelf, Gregson gave the signal. Vargo's hand moved fast. Toward his coat. I raised my revolver from the terrace, and Gregson's men surged from their hiding places. But Holmes had already stepped forward, intercepting Vargo's hand. A brief struggle ensued. Something small and metallic clattered to the ground. Hidden blade, gleaming in the firelight. Vargo didn't resist after that dot as they bound his hands. He stared at Holmes not with hatred, but with a kind of baffled respect. You should have joined me, he said. I did, Holmes replied. Just not on your side. Gregson and the others took him away, silent and defeated. I lingered with Holmes in the now empty room. It's over, I said. He didn't respond at first. Then, quietly, not over, just closed. The roots of this conspiracy go deeper than Vargo. But for tonight, yes, we've severed the head. Outside, the rain had started thin and cold, washing the city clean. Holmes looked out over Baker Street as if listening to some faraway echo. You saw it, didn't you? He said at last, the moment he broke. It wasn't when I exposed his crimes. It was when I questioned his purpose. That's what frightened you most, wasn't it? I said. That he might have been right about the rot, the power, the lies. Holmes didn't deny it, But he turned from the window and said, softly but clearly, he was right about the disease, but wrong about the cure. We sat in silence after that. The fire burning low outside. London slept uneasily, never knowing how close it had come to collapse, or the quiet war waged behind locked doors and velvet curtains. But in that moment, I understood something Holmes never said aloud. In the end, it was not deduction that saved us. It was conscience. It was 2 days after Vargo's arrest that the air began to shift quietly, imperceptibly at first, like a draft beneath a sealed door. Gregson had declared the case closed. The newspapers praised the brilliance of Scotland Yard, and the Whitestone Club shuttered for good. Yet Holmes remained unsettled, not agitated, no. It was subtler than that. A twitch of the fingers, a longer stare at the hearth, a silence between words. I returned that evening from the Strand, where I had picked up the latest issue of the Times. Holmes hadn't touched his violin all day, which in itself was alarming. He was seated at the desk, studying the Vargo files yet again. Still dissecting a corpse? I asked. He didn't look up. The body is dead, but the pulse persists. I frowned. What pulse? Vargo confessed. The Queen of Spades network is dismantled. The last ledger was authentic. There are no loose threads. Holmes finally raised his eyes. That's precisely what bothers me. Vargo, for all his precision, was not a man to confess, and yet, when cornered, he delivered a perfect narrative, a confession with motive, method, even philosophy. It was too satisfying. You think he was protecting someone? I asked cautiously. Holmes leaned back. He was someone's pawn. A brilliant one, yes, but still used, directed. He stood and crossed to the mantel, plucking a single envelope from beneath a stack of correspondence. This arrived an hour ago, he said. No return address, plain parchment. But the seal, see? He turned the wax imprint toward me. A small symbol, nearly invisible. The inverted compass. The same insignia that had appeared on the back of the first poisoned ledger page. The one we had assumed was part of Vargo's encryption scheme. Someone else, Holmes murmured, was marking their presence long before Vargo moved his first piece. He cracked open the letter. There was no text, only a torn page from the Principles of Law, annotated in red ink at the bottom. A single phrase: you solved the wrong case. Before I could speak, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson answered, and, a moment later, Inspector Lestrade stepped inside, pale and disturbed. I wouldn't come unless it was urgent, he said. We just received a call from Blackwall Prison. Vargo was found dead in his cell. My heart dropped. Suicide? Lestrade shook his head. No. Poisoned. No signs of how it was administered. No struggle. The cameras blacked out for 7 minutes. Holmes was already moving. To clean, he muttered. They tied off the end to keep the middle from being unraveled. Within the hour, we were inside Vargo's former cell. There was nothing to indicate foul play, no broken glass, no wounds, not even a spoon out of place. But Holmes's gaze fell on the ceiling, directly above the cot. A small line of soot traced across the plaster. A candle, I asked. Not soot, Holmes replied. Smoke residue. From thermite. Someone melted through the vent shaft. Delivered. A vapor. Vargo never saw them. Efficient. Almost surgical. He turned back to Lestrade. We need access to the prison logs, visitor lists, staff rotations. Lestrade looked grim. Already ahead of you. There was one anomaly, a name logged in as a legal clerk. Only it's not a real name. It's an alias we've seen before. Holmes answered before he finished. Julian Price. Lestrade nodded. How did you? I didn't, Holmes said. But I suspected. Vargo mentioned him once in code. The man with clean hands and no face. Julian Price, a myth among the criminal elite, a fixer, a shadow broker never confirmed, never seen, only fragments of his work surfaced, doctored wills, vanished witnesses, investigations that collapsed without reason. Holmes was pacing now. Vargo was brilliant. But his plan had surgical precision far beyond his temperament. The misdirections, the sabotage, the psychological layering, it was Price's style. The Queen of Spades was his creation. Vargo was only the front. And now he's cleaning up. I said quietly. Holmes stopped. His eyes were brighter now, sharper, cold. We've been chasing a reflection, he said. Price was the architect. He fed Vargo the doctrine, provided the tools, then removed him the moment he lost control. Lestrade exhaled. So what do we do now? Holmes turned to the wall and stared, silent for a long moment. Nothing yet, he said finally. We chase him now, and he'll vanish again. We need to wait. Price is meticulous. He always circles back to study the ruin. And when he does, his hand rested on the torn, annotated page, the one with "You solved the wrong case." He'll show himself, because he wants me to know I missed it. He wants to prove he's cleverer. That is his flaw. That night, Holmes didn't return to his files or his violin. He simply stood at the window, gazing out over Baker Street. London buzzed beneath us, unaware that the game was not over. It had only changed players. 3 weeks passed with no sign of Julian Price, no whispers in the underground. No unusual forgeries surfacing in legal circles. No discreet deaths of witnesses who might have known too much. It was as if the man had simply evaporated into fog, silent, total, deliberate, and Holmes, though calm in appearance, was not still. He was, in fact, waiting for a mistake. It came, not as a grand revelation, but as a minor entry buried in a footnote of a deed transfer, a legal document pertaining to a quiet estate just outside Canterbury. The estate had passed through 3 hands in as many months. The latest transaction was filed under the firm Templeton and Price, a name no one in the legal registry recognized. No office, no clerks. Only a paper trail, and that trail was elegant, meticulous, and false. Holmes's eyes lit up like struck flint when I brought the document to him. He needed only a single glance at the signature. J.M. Price, ESQ. A man like Price doesn't sign, he said, unless he's certain no one will look. We left that night for Canterbury. The estate was remote, tucked behind thick groves and hedgerows that seemed to hush the world around it. The manor itself was modest, not the home of a man living lavishly, but one designed for isolation. A safe house, a retreat, or a trap. Holmes took no risks. We approached by foot from the rear fields, using the tall grass for cover. He'd brought with him a small case, one of those thin metal contraptions he favored for odd purposes. I saw now it contained a miniature periscope, a glass vial, and a lockpick filed into the shape of a bishop's tooth dot at the rear door. He paused. No footprints in the soil, he whispered. Either he left days ago, or he's very, very confident. Inside, the air was still. The curtains were drawn, dust hung in the corners, and the hearth was cold. But on the central desk in the study lay an envelope addressed in that same crisp hand, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. He opened it carefully. Inside was a note. You searched for a criminal. What you missed was a mirror. J.P. Holmes stared at it, unreadable, then moved quickly. He crossed to the wall behind the desk and peeled back a leather panel. Hidden beneath was a thin compartment where a black notebook lay, bound in calfskin, filled with tight, coded entries, transactions, orders, correspondences, all tied to the Queen of Spades. This is it, I breathed. His ledger. But Holmes was already scanning the margins. One symbol repeated itself 3 dots above a line. Morse code for V, not for Vargo, but visitor. He said, these weren't records for Price's eyes. They were written for someone else, another observer, a partner, a patron. That was when we heard the creak above. Holmes raised a hand, silent. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached into the small brass vent above the fireplace and withdrew a wire, thin, copper, and hot. He's still here. We raced up the staircase, Holmes ahead of me. Silent as a shadow, the attic door was ajar. The hinges silent with fresh oil. Inside, a small cot, a desk, and a chair facing the only window. The chair was still turning when we entered. Empty. On the desk, a glass sat, half drunk, a warm pipe, and a small brass key beside a note. Sometimes, Holmes, the best escape is the one you prepare your enemy to miss. Look down. Holmes turned sharply, but I was already at the window. The manor grounds stretched beyond quiet, unbroken. But at the base of the hill, a carriage was vanishing into the trees. The driver's face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and a raised collar. Holmes did not move. He only exhaled once, gone, and yet his eyes weren't filled with frustration, they held something else. Admiration. We returned to Baker Street the following morning, the black ledger secured in Holmes's satchel. Gregson arrived not long after, breathless from his dash across the city, demanding to know what we'd uncovered. Holmes handed over the ledger. Here's your case, he said. Every operation, every payment, every name. Enough to indict 6 dozen conspirators. Gregson stared. But Price, gone, Holmes replied. But not forgotten. Later that evening, as the lamps were lit and London resumed its ceaseless murmuring, I pressed Holmes for the truth. Did you expect to catch him? No, he said simply. Not tonight. He's too careful. But he left more than an empty chair. He opened the ledger again, tapping one particular page. Here, he said, look at the annotations. The circle around 3 dates. One of them is next Friday. I read the notation beside it. M. Returns from Zurich. Package to be moved. M. I asked. Someone Price answers to. Holmes murmured. The real patron. This entire scheme was a tested demonstration of Price's utility to someone higher. Vargo. The Queen of Spades. Even the second murder, they were rehearsals. My stomach turned. So, this isn't over. No, Holmes said. But now we know who's playing. And I have his scent. I stared at him. But justice, did we win, Holmes, or did he? Holmes leaned back, folding his hands. Justice, my dear Watson, is a process, not an end. Price escaped, but only this time. He left behind proof, witnesses, a pattern. He looked toward the fire, and I never forget a pattern. The fire had burned low in the grate, casting a quiet orange hue over the walls of Baker Street. Outside, the night wrapped London in its familiar cloak of damp fog and distant clatter. Holmes stood by the window, unmoving, his silhouette a statue of thought. The case was, by all official accounts, closed. The Queen of Spades had been dismantled, its key figures arrested or scattered. The ledger was in the hands of Scotland Yard. Gregson's name now danced through headlines, basking in a glory built on Holmes's silence. And Julian Price was gone. I sat across from the hearth, nursing a cup of cooled tea, watching Holmes with the unease of a man who knew the case was not truly finished. There had been too many layers, too many actors, and one note still sang faintly in the background and resolved. Holmes turned, finally, as if pulled from some distant memory. Watson, he said slowly, tell me what you remember about the tailor. The tailor? I repeated, surprised. You mean Mr. Cavendish? He was the alibi in the beginning. Falsified records, the stitching timestamp. Yes, precisely. Holmes stepped away from the window. He was frightened, timid, a man dragged into a storm far beyond his station. Yet he was one of the few people who insisted on speaking to me twice. I nodded. He was eager to be believed. Too eager, Holmes murmured, and he used an odd phrase during our second meeting. He said, I only did as the gentleman asked. He said it was for the right kind of justice, not the loud kind. He stopped before his desk and pulled out the black ledger once again. He flipped through its pages to a line I'd read a dozen times before. Funds dispersed, discreet compliance ensured, CCCC, I said. Charles Cavendish. Yet here is the problem, Holmes said. I confirmed something 2 nights ago. Charles Cavendish does not exist. I straightened. What do you mean? The name is real enough, Holmes said. But the man behind it was using borrowed papers. I had a contact in the Home Office examine his license and business registry. The true Charles Cavendish died 4 years ago in India. Whoever posed as our tailor was playing a part. My mouth went dry. Then who was he? I don't know, Holmes admitted. Not yet. But whoever he was, he had access to Price's movements, his patterns. His inner circle. He was no mere pawn. A chill crept into the room, as if the fire had suddenly died. Then there's more to this, I said. Quietly. Another player, or another stage entirely, Holmes replied. He closed the ledger and tapped its cover gently. This book was never meant to be found. Price left it for me not as a mistake, but as a message. What kind of message? That the true game hasn't begun. We fell into silence again, the kind that weighs heavier than speech. My mind reeled with implications: an imposter tailor, a planted ledger, a criminal who fled not in fear, but in control. Holmes broke the silence with a hum of thought. Do you remember the key Price left behind in the attic? Yes. Brass. Small. You gave it to Gregson. I did, Holmes said. But I kept a sketch. And last night, while reviewing my notes, I realized it was not a standard British make. The grooves were French, specifically a model used by a private vault service in Lyon. I stared at him. Do you believe there's more hidden? Believe Price wanted me to follow him, Holmes said. To Lyon, perhaps. Or to someone who knows of that vault. This was his design: to leave a trail, carefully shaped, for one mind alone to follow. And you intend to? Holmes didn't answer immediately. He turned back to the window, watching the mist swirl around gaslight carriages and distant silhouettes. Finally, he said, Price's brilliance lies not in his crimes, but in his restraint. He knows how to vanish, but more than that, he knows when to vanish. That kind of patience. It implies something larger, a deeper objective, and I must understand it. But Holmes, I said cautiously, what if this is what he wants? To lure you? A faint smile touched Holmes's lips. Of course it is. But that does not mean I won't go. The room settled once more into the rhythmic ticking of the clock, the crackle of the hearth, the slow hush of night. I sensed the case was no longer about the Queen of Spades, nor even about Julian Price. It was about an ideal, about control, intelligence, and a rivalry still forming. As Holmes gathered his coat and hat, I asked one last question. Do you think we'll ever know who the real mastermind is? He paused at the threshold. Perhaps not today, he said. But when the curtain lifts, Watson, we will not be in the audience. We'll be on the stage. Then he was gone, melting into the London night, leaving behind a single folded note on the table beside me. It read, There's more truth in what people choose not to say. Keep listening, and so I did, for the whispers that slipped between the cracks, for the small clues buried in routine, for the unseen architect behind the Queen of Spades. Because I knew as surely as Holmes did that this was not the end, it was only the intermission.